Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the aquarium's first annual Ocean Stewardship Lecture Series, which we hope to become part of a series. My name is Heather Deschaines, and I'm the Manager of Youth Development Programs here at the New England Aquarium. For the New England Aquarium, youth development means simply doing everything and anything we can to help to foster young ocean stewards who will ultimately go out and protect our oceans. So I want to thank you for coming this morning, and also to let you know that this event is made possible by the Lowell Foundation. Lowell has generously supported public programming here at the aquarium for many years, and we're excited that the Lowell Foundation supports not only our mission, but the mission to help create future ocean stewards. Today we will feature speakers who sort of represent three different facets of Boston Harbor. We have Elisabeth Colby from the National Park Service, who's focused her efforts on educating youth here in Boston Harbor and raising awareness of the harbor island and islands and its resources. We have Madison Collins, a sophomore from Hingham High School, who's functioning, she'll tell you more, but she's on a journey to really, it's a journey of self-discovery, and it's also one where she is sort of finding that within herself she can make a difference. We also have Alison Nolan, principal of Boston Harbor Cruises, one of the largest ferry companies in New England, and not only do they transport thousands of people on Boston Harbor each and every day, she's looking at ways to help support sustainable Boston in her company. So first up is Elisabeth Colby. Please welcome Elisabeth Colby, who's been working with the Park Service since 2008.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to pull this up real quick, so pardon the... Again, my name is Elisabeth, and I have been working in Boston Harbor more or less since 2008. I started as a college student, not really aware that it was an option, and sort of chased into my newly found dream, and have been the education program coordinator for the park for the last 2 years. We have a pretty exciting variety of programs in Boston Harbor, and we target inner city schools focused around Dudley Square, or for any residents of the city of Boston, what's called the Circle of Promise. Our aim is to foster, in partnership with Thompson Island Outward Bound Education Center, character development, academic achievement, and a sense of stewardship to the environment, which hopefully will take root in Boston but sprawl outward from there. There are a lot of different ways that you can go. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Boston Harbor Islands, it is a partnership park. It was a state park since the 1970s, and the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation owns and operates 16 and a half of the 34 islands and peninsulas that make up the park. In addition to the Mass DCR, there is a National Park Service and 9 other organizations that operate and manage this national park unit. It's a pretty interesting park to work at. That means that if you've come out to the islands, you've likely stepped foot onto an island that's owned by the state, but you've seen also national park rangers there, or you've gone out to a little Brewster Island, which is owned by the Coast Guard, or you've maybe gone to a City of Boston owned island, or a privately owned island, or any number of those combinations. So it's a pretty cool park. Its history, though, is a little bit complicated. It's not a long history, even when you consider dating back geologically. The islands were only formed about 15,000 years ago by glaciers, and they were so enormous, they were covering a significant portion of North America, stretching about 10 or 15 miles out into the ocean. When Boston Harbor, quote unquote, was first formed, the islands were just hills in a dry valley. The sea level was so low that it was about 5 miles east of where it sits currently. As the glaciers continued to melt and we entered into a rapid warming period, within about 7,000 years or less, the islands were formed, and the lower areas in that dry valley of what is now Boston Harbor were formed, and we were given drumlins, which are the hills that you can see in this island right here, formed by glaciers, were surrounded by water. And one of the unique features of our park is that we are the only drowned drumlin field in North America. There's one more in Ireland, and that's it for the entire world, so it's kind of cool. We have had a significant human presence in Boston Harbor. There's human evidence on Peddocks Island dating to over 10,000 years ago, before the islands were even islands. And of course, there's the complicated part of European settlement and wars. There are Revolutionary and Civil War history. There's a little bit of 1812 presence in Boston Harbor as well. But Boston really became Boston as a shipping port. This harbor is its lifeblood. When New England was still a pretty small settlement, Boston Harbor was where all of the goods were coming in through. And well into the 19th century, this was one of the most industrious ports in North America. But in order to make it so, there have been a pretty significant amount of changes. All told, our city is only about 1/3 natural. I'm going to put this animation on, but as you see the slide change, all of the dark green matches the year that's in this bottom corner. Is there a laser pointer on this? Perfect. Thank you. So right here, there's the year. So this will change as well as the land around it. So from about the time of settlement, we started changing our landscape. A lot of Boston was intertidal wetlands and salt marsh, and we've changed that pretty significantly to create a city that would sustain a population such as we have today, and also the businesses and the ports and all of the shipping commodities that are coming through it. But we didn't just change the natural ecosystems, we also changed the way that we operate as a group of animals. We started to consume things at a pretty rapid pace, and rather than sort of living alongside the natural realm, we started to abuse it. And Boston eventually got the recognition of being the dirtiest harbor in the United States. For any of you who grew up in Boston, you may remember not wanting to swim anywhere near this harbor. And so the thought of going out to any of our islands today and going swimming and maybe eating a fish caught locally is a little surprising. But unfortunately, it had to get to this point before that raw sense of stewardship that we feel is so common and we're so eagerly pushing onto our youth today. In the 1980s, a man from Quincy stepped in poop on a beach, but it was human poop. It was incredibly unpleasant, and he was so outraged that he went to the mayor's office, and the city of Quincy filed a lawsuit suing for the degradation of Boston Harbor. It was that which would push forward a number of smaller lawsuits amounting to a pretty significant series of events, and one of the biggest harbor cleanups at that point in the United States history. The progress has been made, or the progress that has been made, is owed largely to creating an efficient and effective water treatment facility. Over on Deer Island, the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority processes over 3 million gallons of wastewater every day from about 50 communities in and around Boston. They're tunneling all of our waste through Winthrop. It's being processed and filtered in several different levels, and then being sent by sludge into Quincy, sort of ironically since they instigated the cleanup. And the clean water is pumped about 9.5 miles into the ocean as fresh water, apparently clean enough to drink, although not without its own repercussions, as that's fresh water and we all know the ocean is salt. However, it's significantly better than the original maneuver, which was to just pump all of our raw sewage out with an outgoing tide. So 21st century technology far beats 19th. But our harbor wasn't just dirty because of our waste. It was also dirty because of the waste that we generated through alternative means. Spectacle Island, among some of Boston's harbor islands, was used as a desirable place to do less than desirable business. And from the early 1900s into the 1950s, Boston, or Spectacle Island rather, was used as a trash dump. It nearly tripled in size from the time that it was formed by glaciers to today, and that's owed largely to about 30 acres of garbage, capped by another 30 acres or so of fill from the Big Dig. That, of course, was the project of putting Highway I-93 underground through the city of Boston, and then all of that fill which was removed through that process was put in landfills, Spectacle Island being one of them. And I'm pretty sure that Spectacle Island is the only landfill that is part of a national park, but we may be open to discussion. Today, however, Spectacle Island is one of the hub islands in Boston Harbor. It's one of the major islands of access in the park. It takes about 15 minutes to get there by boat. You can fish, you can fly a kite, you can swim, you can sunbathe. It's undergone an incredible transformation and is in a harbor which holds a pretty incredible story for environmental degradation and reclamation. A story all of its own of bringing something back to life after it was used in a pretty harsh way. And we've sort of followed on that mode of using our citizens and our local communities to continue building up and improving our natural ecosystems in Boston Harbor. It started with that one man who didn't like that he had to step in something so unsavory as human feces, and we continue that by sort of calling back to the natural order of things, rebuilding dunes on Spectacle Island, and a number of other opportunities. But regarding regarding continuing the development today, we're trying to do so more responsibly. As technology develops, we're all aware of opportunities to improve the way we do things and lessen our impact while we still need inevitably more. So we have in our newer installations and in Hull and in several other locations around the harbor, windmills. Deer Island, for example, uses a number of these renewable resources that I'm going to be talking about. But we have windmills in Hull and Deer Island. We have solar panels on visitor centers and maintenance buildings throughout the park, powering our composting and sort of outhouse toilet systems. And our composting toilets in general require little to no water. On Spectacle Island, it takes about 2 tablespoons of water to flush, rather than 2 or more gallons. But we're also reinvesting ourselves in our youth around Boston. Some of us who grew up in this area may feel like we didn't really get to have this shining, gleaming park, this icon of innovation and environmentalism. And so we're working with inner city schools to sort of break down those walls that had been up for a little while. One of the most exciting programs that we run is a micro-wilderness program, calling on our youth to sort of take a look a little closer at the world around them. We catalog and capture insects, trying to figure out who's living in our park that we might not notice, and take a moment to appreciate the little things which make all of the rest of our day-to-day world possible. We're exploring the salt marshes and gaining a better understanding of why they're so important to our natural ecosystem, and hopefully reflecting back on all of the storms that have been plaguing the East Coast in the last few years and the global community as well, seeing if we can go back to the basics in this sense and sort of rebuild and restore some of the marshes that had been destroyed or impacted through expansion. And then we're also restoring ecosystems. This was during one of our overnight programs where we had on the students' third and last day on the island come and remove an invasive species called broadleaf pepperweed. And this guy found some of the longest roots in his class, improving biodiversity by limiting the spread of this uncontrolled species of plant. But similar to the aquarium, but more focused on the islands, are our Green Ambassadors, which are about 50 students all together, doing some amazing work, going through a curriculum, developing their own job skills, interview, resumes, all that sort of thing, all of that stuff, as well as creating additional space for soft-shell clams and quahogs. We have each year 2 clam seeding events on Thompson Island that are run by our 15 to 18-year-old green ambassadors. They'll invite you out to the island and they'll teach you how to seed about 2,000 clams. Everybody gets a bag and you're spreading them out, you're digging trenches, raking them, protecting them, and then these kids throughout the 2.5 months or so that they're working on the islands will measure the growth. They'll sort of check in on them and see how they're doing to try and improve water quality through this very natural process. These clams are a bit of an indicator species because if the water is too toxic, they're not going to survive. So sort of using the natural order once again. We have a number of service learning projects. Our beach cleanups are one of them, and maybe something that will be expanded on with our Blue Ambassador as well. But trying to give an idea of what's entering into our oceans and how we can prevent that from happening. Sort of doing our part to improve our coastal community. And whatever they experience on these islands is brought home with them once again. So they see that empty chip bag that sort of started to blow out of the trash can in their neighborhood or outside of their school, and they're seeing how much of it is left once it's been in the harbor for a little while or something along those lines. And we had, in one afternoon, in about 90 minutes or less, 60 students pick up 150 pounds of trash on one island at the very end of September. So there's a lot of work to do, and we've got some pretty eager students and some pretty inspiring youth that are ready to do it. We also have a number of programming sort of calling back to our citizens. Check out our park calendars. We had a photo blitz at the beginning of September, the weekend after Labor Day, to try and get a better idea of what kind of things are living in our park without disturbing or destroying them. In historical programs, the National Park Service and other environmental-based organizations has captured or collected different plants, fungus, insects, etc., to identify what they are and sort of gain an understanding of the distribution. With this photo blitz, which the National Park Service is starting to pilot, and I'm sure has been done in other locations as well, we're trying to just take pictures, seeing if we can figure out where it is without taking it out. And this girl, Susanna, was on one of the mushroom walks and found quite a number of different fungi on Pettix Island. So it was pretty cool. But there's a whole lot going on in our park, and there's a whole lot more to come. We're just getting started. We're not even 20 years old yet as a national park, and we're going to keep going so long as we don't keep getting shut down. But there's going to be time for questions at the end. But thank you very much for coming and joining us today, and I'm going to pass this on to our next speaker. So thank you so much.
So I hope we've sort of set the stage with you around Boston Harbor. Next, I'd like to introduce Madison Collins. Madison is a sophomore at Hingham High School. She's on the school's swim and dive teams. And Madison is also currently one of the aquarium's Blue Ambassadors. So you've heard about the Green Ambassadors, we have Blue Ambassadors. I think here in Boston we're going to churn out enough ocean stewards to really make a difference. The Live Blue Ambassador is a service learning program for teens here at the aquarium, and after the presentation and once we get to Q&As we can talk more about that. Just bring up. Madison Collins.
Hi, I'm Madison Collins, and I'm 16 years old, and this is my journey of becoming an ocean steward. When it came to the ocean, like most teenagers, I felt like I wanted to do something, I just never knew where to start. Other than things like recycling and using a reusable bottle, I really didn't think I did much to help my environment. And I drove by local areas, not seeing how these small places affected a larger ocean ecosystem. I knew about Boston Harbor, but I didn't really know it well. I thought really it was just a dirty harbor and with no life that really interested me, and that all changed. My journey began thanks to the help of a small fish. This is a herring, and it's a blue back herring. Herring are a naturalist fish, which means they move from fresh to salt and back to fresh water again. Herring play a crucial role in the marine food web in the North Atlantic. They're the reason that the humpback whales visit our coast each and every summer. Herring are used as bait by commercial fishermen who catch fish we eat, and so they are important to our lives and to the ocean ecosystem. Weymouth Herring Run Cleanup. So this is the herring run right here, and then this is the ladders in which the fish can move up each way to get to the pond. So herring run facts. One of the largest and most productive herring runs is in Weymouth. Herring actually use a run approximately 3 times during their lifespan. The herring run use the run to get to Whitman's Pond in order to spawn, and as hard as it is to attempt to swim up the run, it is also hazardous when there are debris and pollution hindering the water. And the herring run and the health of Whitman's Pond is vital for spawning success. The herring run is monitored by a team of volunteer wardens with support from the town of Weymouth Conservation Commission. My contribution. So we removed several dozen bags of trash, including half a dozen bags of materials that could have been recycled. Surprising finds include tires, shopping cart, and propane containers, and a couch. Yeah, it's weird. We not only cleaned around the water, but we also monitored the water by measuring the water chemistry, including dissolved oxygen content, pH, temperature, and salinity. So that's actually the couch we found right there. And then that's just someone picking up debris, and that's one of the carts we found. So pretty interesting finds. Eelgrass replenishment. So eelgrass is this green plant right there.
Is that a lobster in there?
Yes. So eelgrass is one of the few plants that has adapted the ability to grow in saline water. It grows in beds, and eelgrass creates a nursery to a unique variety of animals such as flounder and skates. It grows in shallow areas but can grow up to 2 meters long. When the waters get murky, the eelgrass is at risk because it relies on the sun to create its energy through photosynthesis. And eelgrass beds are monitored by Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. So, my contribution. So, me and the Liberty ambassadors, we took round burlap mats and weaved grass into them. Each time we finished one mat, they were placed into a large water bath, but until they are attached to a metal rod for storage. So we had to be careful when we were weaving them into the mats that we did not damage the plants and that all the roots were on one side when they got planted. And the mats were prepared so scuba divers could ultimately bring the mats to areas designated for replanting in Boston Harbor and Massachusetts Bay. So this is the water bucket which the eelgrass is in. That's me right there, and here's the burlap mats which we had to weave the grass into so they could be planted. So, this is a water chestnut removal on the Charles River. And so that's me right there, and then all this is the water chestnuts, and it is an invasive species. So it was inadvertently introduced in the 1800s, normally found in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The invasive plant grows rapidly, outcompeting native plants for sunlight, space, nutrients, and lowers the oxygen levels in the water. It also impairs recreational activities because it clogs the waterways, such as canoeing and kayaking. My contributions. So me and the Blue Ambassadors went out in canoes and hand pulled the weeds while seated in a canoe with a partner. So weeds were placed in the center of the canoe in baskets. When the baskets were filled, we had to paddle ashore where another team emptied the baskets so we could refill them. Once on shore, plants were left to dry and hauled to local landfills. Hand pulling is the best solution because chemical herbicides can harm native plant growth. This was done in partnership with the Charles River Watershed Association, and anyone can do this who's willing to get muddy, hot, sweaty, and wet. So here's me, and then here's my partner, and so these are the baskets right here, and here's the water chestnuts going into them, and you can see how we've already started clearing out a small area where they used to be filled with the water chestnuts. So after these recent experiences, I know I can do something to make a positive impact on the ocean. My view of Boston Harbor has changed, and I recognize that Boston Harbor is teeming with life. As I move forward, I feel like I can influence others by setting an example. I feel like whenever I meet children, young or old, that I feel like I can change their opinions on the ocean and of Boston Harbor, because I feel like it all starts with an interest on where you want to change and make something, like, it makes a positive impact. My goal is to study marine biology and learn about connections animals have to ecosystems in which they live. Start somewhere and make a world of difference is my favorite quote, because it really does matter where you start, and once you started, like me, I began this journey and started somewhere and made a difference by getting my hands wet, my feet dirty, and hard work. But most of all, I began with a passion of what I was doing.
You can tell I'm not the most tech-savvy person in the world. Lead to the rescue. So finally we have Alison Nolan. Alison Nolan has enjoyed 17 years with Boston Harbor Cruises. Alison is a fourth-generation principal of a family business founded in Boston Harbor in 1926 and now serves as its general manager. As general manager, she oversees all aspects of Boston Harbor Cruises operations. She is a member of the board of directors for the Boston Harbor Association and serves on its Water Transportation Advisory Committee and chairs its Emerging Professionals Committee. She is vice chair of the Museum of Science's Young Leadership Committee, Original Colonies Regional co-chair for the Passenger Vessel Association, and overseer for the USS Constitution Museum, and member of the Women Working for Oceans, or W2O, group that we have here at the aquarium, and member of SCACL International. Allison was a Boston's Business Journal 40 Under 40 honoree in class of 2012, and a semifinalist for the 2012 Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award for the New England region. Please welcome Alison Nolan.
So Boston Harbor Cruises, as you heard, is a family business, and it was founded in 1926, which makes me the fourth generation. So currently now Boston Harbor Cruises is myself and my cousin Patrick, also fourth generation, and my dad Rick and Uncle Chris make up the management team. This is a photo of my great-grandfather Matthew J. Hughes after he returned from World War II, where he served as a Navy Seabee for many years. He had a singular passion for passenger vessels and being a captain. He holds the distinction of being the youngest licensed captain in the history of the Port of Boston. And he did so at age 16. And the way he got away from that is you're supposed to be 18 to sit for your captain's license. But, you know, back in 1925, there weren't a lot of state-issued photo IDs for young people or people that didn't need to drive. So you would go in, and if you didn't look old enough, you'd bring somebody with you who was clearly over 18, and the Coast Guard would say, is he 18? And they would say, yes, he is, and you would sit for your license. So he went at 16, dragged along somebody who he knew would lie for him, and said he was 18, and sat and received his license. Operating vessels was all he ever wanted to do. So he founded the company with the motor vessel Launchinelli when he was 17 years old, and he operated on the Charles River for many years. They were 30-minute cruises for 10 cents. He had one part-time employee, and what he was really doing was taking people out onto Charles River to alleviate them from the heat in the middle of the city. So imagine it being 90 degrees out in July and living in a 4th-story walk-up with no air conditioning or fans or anything. So people like to be outside, especially in the evenings, and that was primarily his clientele. A lot has changed over the years, and the city of Boston and Boston Harbor Cruises has been fortunate to sort of follow along that trend. He did sightseeing on the Charles River for many years, took a brief hiatus, went into the U.S. Navy, served as a Seabee, as I mentioned, in World War II. Returned to Boston, the company had a new resurgence because he was able to purchase all of this surplus Navy vessel equipment that he then turned into passenger vessels here in Boston. He made a shift to deep sea fishing, so we were a deep sea fishing company for many years, both day trips and overnight trips. And then we had another big change. Faneuil Hall was developed into a tourist attraction shortly thereafter that in 1968. I believe the New England Aquarium came along on Central Wharf. So we saw that, we noticed it. There was a noticeable shift towards tourism in the waterfront area, which had never existed before. The waterfront was a working port. It was ships and shipping and fishing, and not all that pleasant a place to be. So the first two things to really change that was Faneuil Hall Marketplace and the New England Aquarium. So once that happened, we stayed with fishing, but started to get into the sightseeing model as well, because now there were visitors to the waterfront that may want to get out and see Boston Harbor, even though it didn't look like what it looked like today. So now Boston Harbor Cruises has 32 passenger vessels. That makes us the second largest operator of passenger vessels in the United States, behind New York Waterways, who has 36. We have 150 full-time employees, and we grow to 450 seasonally. And what's fun and exciting about that for this group is it's mostly high school and college kids that will spend their summers with Boston Harbor Cruises all the way up and through graduation. What's important about those numbers is it makes Boston Harbor Cruises Boston's single largest maritime employer. So there's no other company than BHC that has more employees that are making a living and living with the ocean in Boston Harbor here. Just a fact, we have up to 264 daily departures every day, commuter boats, sightseeing vessels, whale watches with the aquarium, and some interesting research work we'll talk about a little bit later. And we carry 2 million passengers per year. What's important about the 2 million passengers per year is that's 2 million people that we engage with Boston Harbor and its waterfront that hopefully come away from the experience with a little bit more of a connection to the harbor itself. As I mentioned, we've been operating since 1926, and really it was sort of an environmental free-for-all out on the waterways up until some important dates that start around 1972. In 1972, you have the Federal Clean Water Act, which basically addresses all discharge of pollutants, which is later defined into oceans. So that handles facilities, homes, people standing on a pier, also passenger vessels, and Coast Guard and Navy vessels and shipping vessels. However, vessels have a little bit of a nuance of difference. So in 1973, we have the Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships. So this is specific to discharge from ships. And what's interesting about this chart, as you can see, is that it's still not illegal to dump into water depending on where you're at, how many miles off to shore. So right now you can still discharge sewage 3 miles offshore in the region, so you can take your sewage tanks and offload them if you're offshore. from 3 to 12 miles, there's a pretty decent looking list here of things that are illegal to dump. When you get out to 12 to 20 miles, things start coming off the list. And when you get out past 25 miles, it's pretty much okay to dump anything except plastics. So for companies like Boston Harbor Cruises, this isn't so much of a concern because we pull into port every day. But for long-range shipping, Navy ships that are out for more than 2 to 3 weeks, there is still direct dumping into the oceans from vessels outside of 25 miles. And because once you get outside of 25 miles, there's a lot of question about who owns the waters, right? So then it becomes international waters. So to change things like this is really going to take a sort of global discussion and initiative, because once you get outside of 25 miles, jurisdiction is very unclear. One of the things that Boston Harbor Cruises has done is we were the first in Boston Harbor to install our own private sewage pump out facility. So if you look at our facility at the very end of Long Wharf, we have our own private sewage pump out facility. So all of our vessels, even the ones that go offshore outside of the 3 miles that would be illegal to discharge sewage, we don't do any of that. We bring all of them in and we discharge at Long Wharf. Coming right after that, soon on the coattails, which I won't get into too much because we've already talked about it, was the Boston Harbor Cleanup Project. And what I think is important to note about the Boston Harbor Cleanup Project is not only is it the most significant environmental undertaking in Massachusetts related to the waterways, it's also been incredibly successful in a relatively short period of time. So in 1985, you have the ruling in which we were found in violation of the previously mentioned 1972 Clean Water Act. And the federal government ordered the city of Boston to figure it out. And basically what they wanted was a secondary treatment plant, which we mentioned is now fully operational in Quincy. All said and done, $4.5 billion venture, $3.8 billion dedicated specifically to Deer Island and wastewater cleanup. It's also important to note that part of this project was extending the discharge pipeline from Deer Island to 9.5 miles out to sea. An interesting fact, Boston Harbor Cruises was involved in the cleanup project in that we took for 10 years thousands of construction workers every day from Quincy out to Deer Island because communities like Winthrop and the 1A community did not want the additional traffic and air pollution coming into their community for the 10 years it was going to take to do the repairs and construction at Deer Island. So after the harbor cleanup, there's been a major shift in public perception of Boston Harbor. When Mike Dukakis was campaigning for public office, it was a very embarrassing thing for the city and called the dirtiest harbor in the country. And in fact, the Environmental Protection Agency now calls Boston Harbor a great American jewel. What's interesting about this as well is that the Deer Island facility didn't start coming online until 1995 with its new technology, which is not very long ago. And the whole system was not completed until 2001. So what we're really looking at is 12 years since a completed harbor cleanup and Deer Island wastewater treatment plant renovation. And this is what has happened with the beach conditions here in Boston Harbor. As you can see, there's really nothing below 81%. These are fantastic scores. What the Boston Harbor Cleanup Project has done is it has allowed us to take back the beaches, to recreate inside of Boston Harbor, to go swimming and fishing and jet skiing and kayaking and all of these things that our captains are amazed that people are doing in the middle of Boston Harbor every day. So Boston Harbor Cruises is a company. Obviously we have a great connection to Boston Harbor and the ocean in general. We were recently featured this July in Foghorn Magazine, which is the Passenger Vessel Association industry magazine, on their Green Fleet issue. Passenger Vessel Association has also instigated a Green Waters program that you're allowed to apply to and become a part of. And some of the things that Boston Harbor Cruises does to be environmentally conscious is we have our private dedicated sewage pump out facility. We return all our glass bottles to the distributors, so this year alone that meant 288,000 bottles of beer went back to our distributors. All other recyclables go through a single stream recycling system. Recycling is one of those things that everybody takes for granted and it should be easy, but for us it presented a bit of a challenge. We have plenty of space at our other facilities in Hingham and in Salem and in Quincy to put in what we need for dumpsters and waste removal. Up here in Boston, we did not. We have an area for one dumpster, one compactor, in a dumpster pad that sits behind the Chart House restaurant that houses 2 dumpsters and no more. There would be no approval from the City of Boston to get additional dumpster space or to have any sort of recycling program outside of those 2 dumpsters on that one. One of them belonged to Boston Harbor Cruises, and one of them was shared between the Chart House restaurant and the Custom House block building, which is about a 40,000 square foot office space that has a full set of tenants. It took us about a year in discussion between us and the Chart House restaurant and the owners of the Custom House block building to negotiate putting in 2 huge compactors, one which was a single stream recycle compactor and one was a regular trash compactor, and we now share both units. Boston Harbor Cruises, we offered to manage the installation, and we also promised both the Chart House and the Custom House block that if their trash removal cost them any more money because of this new arrangement, that Boston Harbor Cruises would cover the shortfall. So it was an interesting thing, and that something that is as simple as recycling trash coming off the vessel really posed us with a problem that took almost a year to resolve, and involvement from our local community. Every year, we're a business and we have an obligation to our employees, so there's also every year an analysis of what you can do to improve your environmental profile while still being financially responsible. So every single year, we review all of the products that we purchase to put on the vessels. Oftentimes, there is a more environmentally conscious item, but it might be 3 or 4 times the standard napkin. But those prices always change. So once a year, we meet with all of our distributors and we review everything that we're placing on the boats to see if there is new, more environmentally friendly options that we can put on the boats while still being responsible financially to the company. The other thing that we made an investment in is, as you can imagine, with 32 vessels, we have a lot of waste oil. We installed waste oil furnaces at our dedicated maintenance facility in Charlestown, and that's what we use in the winter to burn to heat those facilities. It's things that may not seem obvious. We make a conscious choice to carpet the vessels in wool over synthetic carpets. Wool carpets are also about twice the price of synthetic carpets, so this is a conscious decision that we're making and spending more money to do it. And then obviously moving towards paperless ticketing and mobile optimized schedules, so we have to print less brochures, things like that. We're also very conscious of burning fossil fuels. Obviously for environmental reasons and also for economic reasons. So we do things like we ramp up our schedules slowly in the spring and we reduce them slowly in the fall. We have meetings with all of our captains to determine what RPMs we would like them to be running the vessels and the engines, because there's significant cost savings. And about once every year, we also revisit doing a conversion on the inner harbor ferries that we run to the MBTA into hybrid vessels. There's a lot happening in alternative fuel for marine engines right now. Probably the most exciting and the one that's gaining the most ground is LNG. They're being developed and implemented into large ships and large passenger vessels, so you're talking over 3,000 passengers are getting new LNG engines. The other thing, beyond recycling and making conscious decisions is what I mentioned before about connecting 2 million people to Boston Harbor and the oceans. So not only is it taking them out on Boston Harbor and hopefully having an enjoyable experience, it's getting some of that conservation messaging into our narrations and into what people are looking at and listening to and understanding when they're on board. So we operate a whale watch in partnership with the New England Aquarium, and it's very important to the aquarium and Boston Harbor Cruises that we get a lot of conservation messaging in on the whale watching. So we talk about not only the whale population, we talk about how connected Massachusetts Bay is to our humpback whale population in particular. We have history going back to, I believe, 1976 is when we named our first humpback whale Salt. And we've since watched Salt have children and grandchildren, all of which we can connect to our cetacean population. So having people have personal connections to what they're doing and what they're seeing out there really invigorates people to be more interested and more involved in the marine environment. We also discuss things beyond recycling that you can do. What do you choose for a restaurant when you go out to seafood? Are you identifying and picking sustainable seafood? When you're putting fertilizer on your lawns, are you thinking about what the runoff implication of that might be, and if those are eco-friendly choices for things like ground fertilizers? So we talk about ways just beyond recycling that people can bring conservation into their daily lives. The other thing that's happening here in Boston that's exciting with relation to the harbor, again, has to do with people's connection. You had the big dig, so the depression of the Central Artery opened up Boston Harbor to residents and visitors to enjoy in a new way. The more people that come down to the Harbor Walk and enjoy Boston Harbor, the restaurants, the new developments, the developments going in South Boston are very conscious to be mixed use. There's incredible opportunities for recreation, dining, and living down in and around Boston Harbor. So the more people who spend their leisure time here, who live here, the more connection you're going to get to Boston Harbor and the more push for conservation. These are some images from our whale watch with the New England Aquarium. And again, conservation is a big message here, as well as education on the whale population. These are both humpback whales. The other thing that Boston Harbor Cruises is newly into is we have an offshore logistics division. So these are all offshore supply and research vessels. This is allowing us to have a very interesting seat to observe new technology in research and conservation. So here we are, this is our OSV, the Scarlet Isabella, and we are out with the Weight Institute. And if you look at the big yellow torpedo-looking thing coming off of the back of the Scarlet Isabella, that is a AUV, so it's an automated underwater vehicle. So it's an untethered ROV. And there's a company called Bluefin Robotics in Quincy that is making these and really breaking new ground in underwater exploration. What's very exciting about the AUVs is that where they're not tethered, they can really go deep. So now we're starting to get new insight into deep water. With insight comes education, with education comes excitement, and with excitement comes conservation. So we took out Weight Institute. We had two AUVs, the Marianne and the Ginger. And what they were doing is they were transiting along this map here. The items in yellow are canyons. So they're underwater canyons right at the edge of the continental shelf, as well as the orange triangles are seamounts. So they were out doing some filming and exploration of underwater canyons and seamounts. We are also taking Bluefin Robotics out to some deep water. They're testing a new AUV in 5,000 feet of water. That's pretty incredible. We've also been doing some work out on Stellwagen Bank with acoustical buoys. So we've got two different types of acoustical buoys here. This is our Captain Ron Hatch up on top, and what he's holding is an iPad with a whale alert app on it. In Stellwagen Bank, in addition to the humpback whales, we have a population of North Atlantic right whales. North Atlantic right whales are on the endangered species list, and it's estimated right now that there's between 350 and 500 right whales, North Atlantic right whales in our area. Right whales had a bit of an issue with ship strikes, was considered a particular threat for the species. And two important things have happened, the first of which and the most effective is there was a move in the shipping lanes to just a little bit outside of their migratory path. And then there's also been an installation of a seasonal management area. So there's an area that we've identified as a right whale migratory path in which no vessels transit more than 10 knots. And that extends from January through May 15th. But in addition to that, they've developed what they call dynamic management areas, which means they change. So if you look right above the BHC logo with the Whale Alert app, you'll see a yellow buoy. That is a right whale acoustical buoy that's tuned into the Whale Alert program that's tuned into the iPad. So these buoys are able to pick up the sounds of right whales in particular. If they hear a right whale, they'll trigger a dynamic management area which will pop up on the app. So you can see it's indicated by that yellow circle. For as long as that dynamic management area exists, vessels will transit that area at no more than 10 knots. and they'll move. So as a whale moves and triggers buoys, the dynamic management areas will change. So Boston Harbor Cruises was asked to test the iPad app on our own offshore vessel, the Gateway Endeavor. So we were the first to have and use the Whale Alert app. And we were also the first to make a commitment to purchase iPads for all of our offshore vessels to install this app on it so they can use Whale Alert. The other thing that we were involved in is also the occasional recovery of the Whale Alert buoys. Because they are listening, they're not tethered by chain, they're tethered by super strong but fine cord and wire, so sometimes they do break away. So our offshore fleet here will go out and recover the acoustical buoys and replace them if needed. The vessel down below is the Matthew J. Hughes. She's another one of our offshore vessels with the big A-frame on the back. She's carrying Maru buoys, and what these buoys do, they're listening for the impact of human noise on cetacean and fish populations. So they want to know, are vessels transiting to and from or through Stellwagen Bank affecting negatively the whale and fish population? So unlike the buoys that sit on the surface, these Maru buoys actually sit 15 feet above the sea floor, and they listen since 2007. And for a while, we were going out every 47 days and recovering the Maru buoys, bringing them in for download and replacing them. So that's what we're doing here in this slide. So I think the important thing here between the things that just a small company like Boston Harbor Cruises and our offshore support division, we're seeing research deep water through Bluefin and what they're doing with their AUV technologies. And we're also seeing a ton of work going into Stellwagen Bank, the understanding of the preservation of and the protection of the whale population through these buoys and other things. And just a side note, I recently last week came back from a diving expedition with the New England Aquarium to Fiji. And also Dawn, who's in the audience, was on the trip with me. And what is amazing is we traveled 1 million hours away from Boston and saw incredible amounts of things. The amount of fish that you see in the photos is really indicative of what you saw down there, thousands and thousands of fish, so closely tied into the invertebrates, corals and things that they live in and with. It really impressed upon me personally how delicate the ocean environment is, and how even up in Boston we are still connected to it. Something else that sort of hit home, if you look down in the picture on the bottom, there's Dawn and I and Lauren and Alan. We went to visit an uninhabited island. So this is an island in Fiji where nobody lives. This is one of 2 piles of plastics that we collected from an uninhabited island, and the second pile of plastic was even larger than this. And what it sort of brought home for me is really what happens with our oceans is a global community, it's a global discussion. If you look up on top, this is a surface current chart of the oceans. So you can see that what happens in Massachusetts doesn't necessarily stay in Massachusetts, how impactful we are to the rest of the environment and how impactful other states and countries are to what's happening here in Boston. So it was just a reminder to me sort of how big the world is and how what we do here really impacts others in other places. So that's it.
I want to thank our speakers again. They really did a wonderful job. We are going to open up the floor to questions, so in a minute I'll ask them to stand, but I just wanted to make one final sort of closing remark about Boston Harbor and all of our connections to it, really. In that I think as individuals, we all know what we can do to protect the environment. We all know to take shorter showers, reduce the amount of energy we use in our homes, be mindful of the purchases we make. Those are all wonderful examples of individual-based actions that each of us is very capable of doing on our own. And I think here at the aquarium, what we'd really like to see is for people to sort of make those individual actions part of our social norm. And I think habitually we all think back to this morning when we brushed our teeth. How many of us actually turn the water off? I'd be willing to bet that at least 80% of us in the room probably did that. Those types of things are very quickly becoming norm for our society. And I think the next step for us is to really start to function at the community and state level, coming together like Maddie did with the teens in the Live Blue Ambassador program to go and target singular areas for cleanup, just like Alison is doing with her company to address, sort of the company's stance and to help influence the thousands of passengers they carry every day. And just like Elisabeth does on Boston Harbor, really informing each and every person that goes out there. So again, I want to thank you, but also if you do have questions, I'd like to invite our speakers to come up. Yes?
I just have a question for Alison. How do you know if the whales are distressed from those noise monitors you put down there?
I think that's probably a better question for the people we gave the buoys to when we brought them back
Oh,
in.
okay.
So I'm not, Laura, do you know what they're listening for? This is Laura, she's our Director of Marine Education at
Like
Boston.
the whale buoys. I mean, well, they're listening. I mean, more of them are listening to the locations from the right whales. So most of the app is just to have aware of their presence. And so, you can't always tell if it's distressing sound from the noise that they're making, but at least you can be aware of their presence and navigate your boats a little bit better.
There is discussion with the Maru buoys, the ones that sit underwater, that some people believe that whales are very acoustical communicators, and there's some belief that ship noise from propellers and engines traveling through whale environments will impact their ability to communicate with each other and then create stress based upon that added noise that isn't typically in their environment. So that's part of what they're looking for. How they are able to determine whether or not that noise is bothersome, I'm not sure. Yes.
I had another question for Alison. I was wondering where the funding for the whale protection buoys and so forth comes from.
A lot of that was, there's two LNG deep water ports, one the Northeast Gateway by Accelerate Energy, and then Suez Energy has another. The state and the EPA was good about really discussing with both Accelerate Energy and Suez how their environmental mitigation funds might be spent. So a lot of what you see happening with the Maru buoys and the whale acoustical buoys is coming out of the LNG companies that opened up the terminals offshore from Massachusetts.
So all those solar panels and windmills, do you know who or what organization sort of was impetus for that, or how to get it implemented? It's great to see it.
So the solar panels on the islands were installed largely through the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. They're part of their facilities, and I think they may have been partially funded through grants with the National Park Service. The windmills in Hull and on Deer Island were done through municipalities. So the windmills in Hull over by Pemberton Point are powering a significant portion of the town's traffic lights, street lights, a little bit of the school's energy bill, and I believe around between 10 and 20%, maybe even more of the energy footprint for the Deer Island water treatment plant is produced through either solar, wind, or by the methane burning that's released as a process of the digestion of that sewage waste. So they're very innovative in the ways that they're capturing that energy.
It's also worth noting that as part of the National Park Services and the Island Collaborative's long-term management plan for those resources, that the resources be maintained sustainably. So I think going forward you will continue to see more of that type of greening of not only the park but of all of Boston.
The pavilion on the Greenway, about a block down from where we are now, is powered through solar panels that are on the top of our pavilion, and the light display was sort of designed to be low energy enough that it displayed data patterns that are designed by MIT and other sort of visual artists, but can use just the energy generated from the roof panels.
That's great.
Any questions? Oh, yes.
So I have a question for Elisabeth about, I can't remember the name of the island, but the one that was being used for
The Spectacle Island.
Spectacle Island, and what you're feeling about the trade-off between using it for landfill and then also, you know, the fact that now there's a bigger island that you were talking about, what a wonderful place it is. And so is it a bad thing or a good thing? And
You know, that's an interesting question, and I think there are personal opinions on that. The fact of the matter is, it's either buried or it's burned. So the location of it isn't ideal for me personally, but the way that it was renovated was a pretty intentional process. Basically, they moved all of the garbage to put a layer to capture any runoff that's caused from that degradation underneath the waste. So everything's been moved, and it's completely capped and contained. All of the sort of decomposition that's occurring still is being tunneled out to Deer Island, and one of the additional costs that was part of that water treatment plant renovation. But you know, it's better capped and being made aware of on the island now as sort of an educational tool. The island was discontinued as a trash site or as a grease reclamation plant because of an incinerator that was put into South Boston. So it sort of stands now as without trash cans being on Spectacle Island, as there's enough garbage here, so we can sort of learn from our past mistakes to try and use our resources a little more responsibly. But of course, it would be nice if there weren't 80 feet of trash. So,
thank you.
yeah.
Yes.
This is kind of a Far East question, but the problems that Fukushima is having with the radioactive water that they're just spewing into the Pacific, how long do you think it's going to take for that to be a problem for us? Or do you think it'll be a problem for us?
I can sort of address some of that. I know there are several scientists at Woods Hole Oceanographic who are looking at sort of the chemical reaction between radioactive isotopes that are released during a nuclear leak and seawater. And there's some very interesting chemistry that occurs where seawater naturally does have certain types of isotopes that sort of match the chemical pattern of the isotopes that Fukushima is putting out. And so at the moment, the immediate concern is for the coastal waters near the Fukushima province. But as you go further out, the more that's diluted, the less concern there is. So I know there's a lot of misinformation that is currently out there. There's some maps that have been going around that sort of depict these red plumes emanating into the ocean. And the reality is the chemistry works in our favor, and that's part of why you see so many reactors placed along coastlines, is that seawater and radioactive isotopes sort of balance each other out. I'm not saying it's a perfect match, and if there's a chemist in the room who'd like to chime in, please feel free. But it really comes down to how that chemistry works. And at the moment, because more of it was released into the ocean than into the air, which was the case with Chernobyl, you're seeing less of that catastrophic fallout. And so, do we want to eat the seafood right off the coast of Japan? Probably not for the next couple of years. But the further into the Pacific you get, the effects have been greatly lessened. And at the moment, the major consensus among the leading experts is that seafood from the Pacific Ocean is safe. So I think.
Well, they're already finding that the tuna off the Pacific coast of California is radiated. So do you think that's a different source?
I sort of question some of these results and some of the information that's being out there. Again, I trust what the oceanographers at Woods Hole and Scripps out in California are saying, and what tuna, by and large, because they're a larger predatory species, they tend to bioaccumulate toxins in the water much differently than the smaller fish. It's tough to say whether or not what they're seeing in tuna is a direct result of Fukushima or other influences that might be happening closer to home on the California coast. So I'd be happy to give you some wonderful reading if you were interested to kind of help broaden the scope. And it's a tough thing to understand because there's a lot of chemistry and language involved that we don't always understand. But, I think given that certainly raises the alarm level, and it makes us think, by and large, I think the trusted experts are saying, that's what you see. So it's a very good
That makes me
question.
feel better.
Anyone else?